Hello everyone, I am Chester, or Clam, and I often write articles on the site Chips and Cheese, so be sure to check that out for some more very technical content. Here I'm going to be talking a bit about AMD Strix Halo with a special focus on a particular aspect of its memory subsystem. Strix Halo is AMD's highest-end mobile chip and has a huge integrated GPU. And to feed that on the memory end, it has a 32 megabyte memory side cache, also marketed as Infinity Cache, and that sits in front of a 256-bit LPDDR5X memory bus. So AMD has had this Infinity Cache thing going for several generations in their discrete GPUs. That's a slide there presented at Hot Chips when they presented their RDNA 2 architecture, which was the first one to introduce this Infinity Cache. But so far, I've only been able to get performance data from those discrete GPUs through AMD's performance monitoring tools, and those tools don't show any data past the GPU's L2 cache. So I've always been curious about how well Infinity Cache does in practice. I mean, after all, this is a really important part of the GPU's memory subsystem. I just don't have any visibility into it. So enter Strix Halo. It has all of the performance monitoring capabilities you would expect from any recent AMD CPU, including performance counters at Infinity Fabric, or at least a part of Infinity Fabric that carries data requests. That's also known as the Scalable Data Fabric, or just Data Fabric in their documentation. It also has performance counters at the memory controllers. These are UMCs, Unified Memory Controllers, in AMD's terminology. So I can look at how much memory traffic is going through Infinity Fabric, how much of it is showing up in the memory controllers, take the difference, and then use that as a proxy for how much traffic got served off of Infinity Cache. Because remember, the goal of Infinity Cache, or any cache really, is to keep traffic off of the next level in the memory hierarchy, which in this case is the LPDDR5X memory. So on Infinity Fabric, AMD documents a single performance monitoring event on Zen 5 that measures data bandwidth. Its event encoding is 1F in hexadecimal for most cases, or 1E in the case of core coherent masters that serve core complex dies, CCDs. 1E targets the first link of a core complex die, 1F targets the second link. Everything else just uses 1F. But to use this event, the thing is you have to pick an instance ID to monitor in the high bits of the event select field, and then say whether you want to look at read or write beats in the unit mask. You can also pick some things that don't really matter for this case, like whether you want to count remote or local traffic. That's for servers. This is a single socket client chip. That doesn't really matter, and I've just set it to count all sources. AMD's Strix Halo has 8 counters for the entire Infinity Fabric. That's chip-wide, so I can monitor 8 different things at once. AMD never published the instance IDs for Strix Halo. They have for some server products, as you can see there, but for Strix Halo, I kind of have to poke around and see what's what. So a brief diversion. This is roughly what the Infinity Fabric layout looks like with regards to endpoints and their instance IDs. I basically used the data bandwidth event with various instance IDs, generated memory traffic from various blocks, and then checked what lit up. So all of this is guessing based on where I see traffic and what I'm doing to generate that traffic. It is not documented by AMD. Like servers, the instance IDs appear to start with the coherent stations, or the CSs. These sit at the memory end of Infinity Fabric, right in front of each memory controller. So their job here is to ensure coherent memory access. So that means, say, if I am one CPU core I've written to my cache, like modified a cache line, and it's still sitting there in my cache, and some other core or some other block elsewhere needs to read it, then they need to get the data from my cache, not the stale data in DRAM or in Infinity Cache, actually. So the CS's job is to track cache line states throughout the system, and to ensure that if there is another block that could have modified the line, it sends a probe and does a cache-to-cache transfer. So it can satisfy a request, of course, by going to memory, but it can also satisfy it by going to either Infinity Cache or a peer cache, and that last one is going to be a source of error, so do keep that in mind. The CS is also where AMD, of course, puts Infinity Cache, and that's actually a really logical place to put it, because the CS observes all memory requests going through Infinity Fabric to physical addresses that are backed by DRAM. Strix Halo has 16 memory channels. These are 16-bit LPDDR5X channels. Each has a memory controller instance. Each has a CS. So these are numbered 0 through 15. Then if you keep going up on the instance IDs, you get 8 endpoints that service the GPU. So the GPU has a very wide interface into Infinity Fabric. Then you get to the CPUs. The layout here is kind of interesting as well. These endpoints are called CCMs, Core Coherent Moderators. These things have a memory map. It takes your the address of your memory request, the physical address, looks it up in the memory map, and decides where to route it. Anyway, there are two CCMs on Strix Halo. The way AMD does these CCMs in Zen 5 is that each of them actually has two links. You monitor the first link with event encoding 1E, actually. 1F counts bandwidth for everything else, but for CCMs, it counts on the second link. So you can see, like, this is going to the service setup, right? Turin has 8 CCMs, and a service has 16 CCDs. It does it by having two links per coherent moderator. Well, in Strix Halo, there are two core coherent moderators, and each of them has the first link enabled, so that's event 1E. Anyway, that's just an interesting observation. Then as you keep going, you find the NPU, you find the media engine. That thing generates more bandwidth when you start encode job. Goes up from basically nothing to like gigabytes per second, right? You have the display engine. If you run display at 1080p, it see about 150 megabytes per second. Increase the refresh rate to 180 hertz, and you get like 400-ish megabytes per second. So that's the display engine. Then on InstaSID 2.0 in hexadecimal, if I generate SSD read traffic, then like say 400 megabytes per second of that, I observe it as write traffic on that InstaSID. So what basically happens is the CPU sends requests to the SSD, which then reads the blocks like off of flash, and it satisfies the requests by writing that data back to main memory. And then those writes are then observed as writes from the perspective of Infinity Fabric, from the perspective of that endpoint. And then if you keep going, there's InstaSID 2.1. That has traffic, has non-zero counts. I have no clue what this thing is. Like, I've tried some things like playing audio, and then it goes up to like 1.5 megabytes per second, counting each count as a 64-byte access, which is not always universally the case, by the way. So across all of these blocks, one data beat is 64 bytes per cycle, but for the CPU, it is 32 bytes per cycle for a read, 64 bytes per cycle for a write beat. Anyway, there's very low beat counts on this InstaSID 2.1, and I cannot isolate any activity that causes it to increment, but like not other things. So moving on. If I want to go after Infinity Cache, the really relevant portion of the memory subsystem is the CS layer and the UMC layer. So for monitoring Infinity Fabric, I have 8 counters. For monitoring the memory controllers, I have 4 counters per memory controller. So that makes it really easy to monitor the memory controllers because I only need one event to count CAS commands, CAS column address strobe. For the CSs, it's harder because I have to use 2 counters per CS, one for reads, one for writes, and I only have 8 counters total. So I can only monitor 4 CSs at once. But fortunately, memory traffic is striped evenly across the memory controller channels. That's how when you go from like single channel to dual channel, you get double the memory bandwidth in practice. Same going here from like to like a 256-bit 16-channel memory configuration. But the interleaving is not perfect. Like if you monitor the UMCs, all of them, you're going to see like a few percentage points of difference. So multiplying the count by 4 and monitoring 4 CSs is mostly fine, but keep in mind that this is not perfect. There could be a few percentage points of error here. So while we're at sources of error, going back to the CSs, because you can satisfy memory requests either by going through downwards to Infinity Cache and to the memory controllers, or by going like sideways to another block, for example, with a core-to-core transfer across CCX boundaries, that's another source of error. That kind of traffic tends to be very low for a couple of reasons. One is that coherency traffic is generally low, much lower than like, regular memory accesses. And the other is that during gaming workloads, Strix Halo tends to park the second CCD. So that's core parking in Windows. It won't schedule anything on there. So for that reason, I expect not much error from this, but it is something to keep in mind. The next issue is a really more significant one because I observe CPU and GPU traffic at the CSs. Of course, I mean, the coherent stations sit in front of the whole physical address space backed by DRAM, right? So they're going to see everything. And the CPU is a problem because the Infinity Cache here targets the GPU. CPU side memory requests don't even allocate into that cache. So the Infinity Cache is not effective for serving CPU side traffic, and that's completely by design because remember the CPU has its own 32 megabyte L3 cache. You don't want CPU side data polluting the Infinity Cache and potentially kicking out GPU side data and making that hit rate worse for the GPU that actually needs this to keep from running into DRAM bandwidth bottlenecks. But what this means is that if you start counting it as like a standard hit rate thing, like counting requests at the CS as requests and requests at the UMC as misses, And then you have a technically correct view of the hits and misses, but not a logically correct one from the perspective that the whole design goal of Infinity Cache is not to service all memory requests throughout the system. It's just there to prevent the GPU from running itself into DRAM bandwidth limits. You can see there I did a bit of measuring at the request side, so the coherent moderators. You can see in green and purple, that's the CPU side traffic and 2 workloads, 2 games. And in blue is the GPU side traffic. So you can see the CPU side traffic is a very minor portion of it, but I would say it's minor, but getting into a significant part where you don't want to look at this as an absolute hit rate figure, right? It could be like 10%. It would depress the hit rate somewhat because it is like some percentage of the memory traffic. So I don't want to look at this as like just a hit rate thing. I want to focus on how much traffic is being kept off of the DRAM controllers and being serviced on chip. The final source of error is the way I'm measuring this. So this is a piece of software that I wrote several years ago because I'm curious about hardware performance. You can probably tell that already. This is something that lets me look at programmable performance counters and be as easy to look at as like a regular hardware monitoring program like Hardware Info or heck Windows Task Manager. So I sample data every second and I update the interface. And that creates the same problems as what Task Manager runs into with like a 1-second update interval. So if you think about measuring CPU usage, right? If you have a CPU usage spike that lasts for half a second and then the usage goes to 0 for the other half of the second, it's going to get reported as 50% usage over that sample interval. And I have the same limitation here. Of course, not with CPU usage, but anyway, this is about taking a tool I have. I have a hammer. Everything looks like a nail. That's exactly what happens here. It's what I can do with the available free time I have, basically. But don't expect the kind of precision here that you would get from a vendor-provided tool that can sample on like the millisecond scale or faster. So with all that in mind, let's have a look at some results. First, this is the 1-second interval from log to data from my tool, where the DRAM controllers are facing down the highest DRAM bandwidth demands. So basically, I'm looking at what is Infinity Cache doing when the memory bus is under the most pressure. Is it doing enough? So for reference, Strix Halo has a 256-bit bus running at 8 gigatransfers per second to LPDDR5X, so that provides 256 gigabytes per second of DRAM bandwidth. Now, you don't want to push too close to down average because then your service latency is going to start going up from queuing effects. Requests are going to start piling up at queues and delaying each other. So as an arbitrary kind of like threshold, let's look at 200 gigabytes per second. So as a line for when you might be starting to get heavy on the balance side, might be starting to see that much higher latency. Across this limited set of workloads, bandwidth demands are actually very well controlled across this set. If you want to look at an approximate hit rate figure with all of the caveats in mind, you can look on the right. That's going to vary a lot. You cannot give one hit rate figure and expect it to be representative of a wide variety of workloads. So if you want to say like, this is what I expect from a 32 megabyte Infinity Cache, sorry, you're not going to really get that. I mean, you can't give a single figure. In Port Royal, for example, that's 3DMark's ray tracing benchmark. Only about 22% of memory traffic was kept off of the DRAM controllers at that 1-second interval when at the highest DRAM bandwidth demands. And then you can look at other cases, like a DirectX 11 benchmark, Valley. In that case, the Infinity Cache seems to eat the majority of the requests coming through Infinity Fabric, and the demands on DRAM are relatively low. Well, compared to some other examples here, at least. Another data point I wanted to look at is the maximum observed bandwidth at the coherent station layer, again, over a 1-second sample interval. So instead of looking at how much Infinity Cache is doing and whether it's doing its job, this is kind of like how much DRAM bandwidth might you need in a hypothetical setup where you decide to not have Infinity Cache, decide to just put the Strix Halo GPU there with its 2 megabyte L2, and then drop everything on DRAM after that. A good proxy for this is actually the PS5 chip, because that, according to Digital Foundry, has very similar performance to Strix Halo. The PS5, for its part, has a 256-bit GDDR6 bus running at 14 gigatransfers per second for 448 gigabytes per second of bandwidth. So if I take 75% memory bus utilization as an arbitrary threshold for saying like I am now heavy on bandwidth, I'm probably going to start to see bandwidth bound effects from it. That would be about 336 gigabytes per second. And then we see the vast majority of cases here can be handled with such a setup without reaching that point, with just one borderline case that is 3D Mark times by extreme, which runs at 4K. It gets to 335 gigabytes per second at one point, but you can see how this kind of setup, like in the PS5, is also balanced from its own perspective, just using a lot more DRAM bandwidth and less cache. And again, we can look at hit rate for those points. It is actually really high in 3D Mark times by extreme. A lot of the traffic is getting serviced out of that 32 megabyte cache. Another question is the role of resolution and what role it plays with regards to hit rates. Because AMD's slide back then showed 3 different lines for 3 different resolutions and implied that higher resolution tends to lower hit rates. So here I'm using a couple of benchmarks that can be very easily set to run at any resolution, regardless of what monitor I have, and the results largely line up. I presented a data point here with the maximum observed bandwidth at the memory controllers, although it is actually very often the same, like maximum bandwidth at the CS, maximum bandwidth at a UMC. It's just a really bandwidth intensive point in the benchmark, and it usually tends to be the same point in these benchmarks. Approximate hit rate, if you will, tends to be best at low resolutions, so at 720p, it is capturing roughly half the traffic. As you go to 8K, that extreme corner case, it drops to less than a quarter. That's a relatively small percentage of memory request traffic going through Infinity Fabric getting caught before it hits the DRAM controllers. But the question is not like hit rate, right? I want to stay away from that, not just because it's potentially inaccurate because of CPU side traffic, but because the goal of Infinity Cache is to create a balanced setup that doesn't run into DRAM bandwidth bottlenecks. It doesn't necessarily need the highest hit rate to do its job. It just has to get enough traffic off of the memory controllers so that they're not pegged and running into bandwidth limits. And if I look at the bandwidth demands, they actually remain under control at all resolutions, including that 8K corner case. Traffic does increase on the memory controllers. They are under more pressure at 8K, but not by enough to really push them to their limits. Now, if you look at the frame rates, average frame rates during this benchmark, you can see that at 8K, this is not a GPU designed to run this workload at 8K. 11, 12 frames per second is not where you want to be. Now, hypothetically, if you had a GPU that is designed to achieve 30 frames per second at 8K, and you put the exact same cache setup in there, then yes, you would have problems. Because if you very approximately, if you multiply bandwidth demands by 3 to really approximate what that looks like, you would need to serve 525 gigabytes of total bandwidth with some combination of DRAM and Infinity Cache. And you would probably need either a bigger DRAM setup, a bigger cache, perhaps even bigger caches in front of the Infinity Cache, or some combination of all that, right? But again, this is not a GPU meant to run this at 8K, at least not in this workload. And the memory subsystem is doing just fine at avoiding DRAM bandwidth limits. It is still a well-balanced setup. Another example, Wildlife Extreme. This is actually a bit of a lighter workload because this is meant to run on mobile devices. So you see some absolutely crazy figures, like pushing past 300 frames per second at 1080p, or pushing past 100 frames per second at 4K, and then you go over to this crazy 8K case, right? And then you're still sustaining an average of over 30 frames per second in this integrated GPU that pulls a lot less power than a discrete GPU. That's kind of funny. Anyway, I find it funny. But again, the same trends apply. Increasing resolution decreases Infinity Cache hit rate. It starts to become less effective at keeping bandwidth off of the DRAM controllers. But even with the higher bandwidth demand at the memory controllers, it still remains a pretty well-balanced setup throughout those resolutions. You're not running into DRAM bandwidth limits, even at 8K, which has the highest DRAM bandwidth demands. Although if you want to take this and say I want to double or triple it to try to hit higher frame rates, then yes, you would probably need a more sophisticated memory subsystem with higher caches or more DRAM. Another point I want to make is to combine data from both AMD's own tools that can look into the GPU private caches, as well as my tool to look at the Infinity Fabric side, and look at the role of Infinity Cache, and really emphasize that Infinity Cache is only playing part of the role in handling memory bandwidth demands. There are a lot of cache levels, even from the GPU side, and Infinity Cache is just one of those levels. So you can see that this kind of approximation isn't perfect. I've actually marked a substantial question mark spot on Titanic Honor and Glory in their demo 401, where there's L2 misses counted by AMD's developer tools that aren't that don't correspond to the request rate I see at the coherent stations. I suspect a huge part of that is down to compression because the GPU could, for example, like look at, let's say, a 128 byte cache line, maybe that compresses, and then the compressed data is less than 64 bytes, and that results in just a 64 byte request out to the memory subsystem. That could be the case. Of course, there's also good old sources of error, right? But the big picture is that a lot of GPU side memory requests actually have really good locality and are handled at smaller, faster caches within the GPU. The bulk of memory requests are actually handled at the 32 kilobyte L0 caches, and then the L1 caches are 256 kilobytes. The L2 caches is 2 megabytes for the whole GPU. Those two cache levels take a good chunk of the bandwidth as well. And then once you look past that, infinity cache plays a role, of course. But if you look at all of the memory bandwidth demands, all of the memory requests coming from the GPU, the infinity cache by itself is only a small part of the picture. Another observation here is if you were to somehow try handling all GPU side bandwidth demands with a gigantic DRAM subsystem, like if your cache designers just completely dropped the ball, you would need multiple terabytes per second of bandwidth to feed a GPU the size of the one in Strix Halo. So for perspective, this is like the size of this GPU, yes, it's a big odd GPU, but in terms of comparing to GPU performance, this is a lot closer to like a lower mid-range, like let's say RTX 4060 or RX 7600 XT on AMD's end. So that really underscores how important caching is to GPUs, because trying to feed a GPU of this size with like just DRAM, you would need something like the MI300X's memory subsystem, and that is ridiculous. Okay, I want to get into some examples here. So you can see this is the tool kind of sitting here. I am monitoring data at the unified memory controllers here. I can monitor across all of them, column mattress strobes. I've actually programmed another counter to monitor the memory clock. It's sitting here at about 1 gigahertz, although this does change dynamically depending on load. It does not change right now, and you can see some bandwidth load because I am recording this and I have load on the video engine. You can actually see, yeah, here. So moving on. We have the coherent stations. I have to monitor reads and write separately, as you can see here, and I can only monitor 4 instances at once. So I am multiplying it automatically into totals, and then estimating hit rate off of it. Again, hit rate estimate, this is an estimate of, not directly of hit rate, but of the amount of traffic showing up at the CSs being satisfied on chip. This here is a micro benchmark. I did not write this. Someone else wrote this. This is written by Neems, GPUs are magic on Twitter. And this is the tool this is unmodified except for restricting it to a set of test sizes that you can see here. Starts in infinity cache and then spills out. That way I can show you what the traffic looks like. So as it starts, you're going to see all of the traffic here being served off of the CSs and basically not showing up as unified memory controllers. As the test progresses, you can see it start to show up equally in both parts. And that's because as at the larger test sizes, infinity cache hit rate basically drops to 0 or near 0. And you can also see that the figures line up from both the hardware performance counters and the software observed measurements. That's how you can get a bit of confidence in your measurements. Okay, so let's actually get into a bit of a graphics workload. So let's move that to the side. Let's start up a game. This is GHPC, Gunner Heat PC. It is a sim light. You get to play around with armored vehicles, and it's set in 1985 in a hypothetical fall the gap kind of Cold War gone a little bit not cold situation. Let's start up the mission. You can see varying loads on the memory subsystem here. When the loading is not actually rendering anything, but it's like hitting the CPU, you're going to see that the memory demands are lower. CPUs tend to not be very bandwidth hungry in gaming workloads. That stands in contrast to the GPU, which is permanently bandwidth hungry. Okay, as we're loading through. Okay, now we are in the game, we are rendering stuff. Just looking over this cute little field here, it's about 40% of traffic at the CSs being serviced on chip. You can see that changing as things change. If I start looking at something different, so let's say I look at the tree line, I zoom in on the like binoculars on a tree line, it goes up. So that kind of underscores the point that like infinity cache hit rate will vary. It will vary across different workloads. It will vary in the same workload based on what you're doing. So do not try to give one hit rate figure for a 32 megabyte cache. That is an exercise in futility. Okay, as we head towards the ridge here, gonna crest the ridge, and we're gonna see some stuff, probably, maybe. Oh, okay, yeah, I think I see some stuff. Okay, laser rangefinder. Okay, and I'm sure. Let's see. Gonna manually lead this one. Nope, didn't drive that way. Okay, I think I killed it. Okay, hit that one. Oh, by the way, in the thermals, you can see that traffic is generally lower everywhere because this is actually simulating a thermal site in the 1980s. These have low resolution. So it's rendering at low resolution, and the bandwidth demands actually decrease. So 55 gigabytes per second at the CS. Funny enough, you could actually satisfy those bandwidth demands using a plain dual-channel memory controller. Okay, back into the day site. As you can see, I'm obscured by smoke, but then funny enough, when I see a lot of smoke effects, the infinity cache hit rate does tend to increase. Whether that be gun smoke or like smoke from dirt getting thrown up in my face, which is not very nice. Okay, there's another guy here. I get a good track for auto lead. Nope, I have a bad track. Okay, gonna back off a bit, pop smoke. And then you know what? Why not? Let's just look into the smoke and see what happens. Again, the hit rate goes up. So lots of variation here. Yeah, above 50% now, and that's likely an underestimate too. Okay, so let's pop out of this. Let's make sure. So in this now, all of the load is on the most of the load is on the GPU now. Looking at the after action stuff. Okay, you can see how bad of a gunner I am. That's okay. Okay, so that's one workload as an example. Let's close out of that. Whenever that closes, okay. And let's look at another example. Let's look at Dark Souls. Standard FromSoft stuff. Let me move that over because it does not want to play nice. Older games tend to be funny. Hello? Okay. Yes, FromSoft. Yes. Yes, indeed. We don't really need anything. This is just like kind of walking around anyway, so that should be just fine. Okay, and I mean, after all, we're just playing around, so no need to have any equipment really. Yeah, okay, so running through this like first area, fairly depressing game. You can see the bandwidth demands. It's roughly the same picture as before, about 90 something gigabytes per second, and much less making its way through to the unified memory controllers. And then running across this area, gonna light a bonfire. And then, oh yeah, actually looking out over this area, hey look, it's keeping even more traffic off of the memory controllers. Okay, now we get to this little arena looking thing. You can see this, the bandwidth demands from this DirectX 11 workload. Fairly tame. Look, I help you. I pulled the sword out. Okay, what you gonna do? Oh, that's not very nice. So this is an older game. Still pretty reasonably good graphics. Yeah. Stop trying to grab me. Another grab. So if you ever wondered what bandwidth demands look like during a Dark Souls scuffed boss fight, this is about what it looks like. You can also observe that the read traffic and write traffic are not very balanced here. There is a lot more read traffic than write traffic. You probably saw that before as well. So that is a common pattern seen on CPU side workloads. And oops. Oh, that was not parryable. That was oops. Anyway, probably not the best game to play around with while talking about memory activity and looking at my own program, but that's what I get. Yeah. Do I have any other examples here that I want to? Let's run some Baldur's Gate. Let's close this launcher. Who cares? Again, when you're loading and it's mostly CPU load, you can see that the overall bandwidth demands are low. And also, when there's CPU bandwidth demands, writes also massively outnumber reads. Okay, yeah, this is and last slide in. Okay, there. Now we're at a higher resolution. Okay, 2820. Yeah, so it's taking some traffic off of the unified memory controllers, but not that much. If I move around, some pretty high bandwidth demands actually at the CS level. Well, I wouldn't say super high. You can kind of get a sense of what the average looks like, not the maximum. Like when you're just playing. And you can see that in some cases, you could actually satisfy the bandwidth demands here just barely using a fast dual channel memory controller. Or I should say 128-bit standard, standard client memory controller. So if you have like half the memory bandwidth, 120 gigabytes per second, this would be just barely okay, like right now. But as you can see, there are of course other points where you get more bandwidth bound, and you would be in a little bit more trouble. Okay, so that takes care of that. And to close out, I would actually like to thank ASUS. Massive thanks to them for sampling this device. It would not have been possible without their help. I've had this for a bit over a month now, and it's been a really awesome showcase of what can be done with an integrated GPU. I also have a lot more aspects of Strix Halo that I'm going to check out with this device, so stay tuned, especially on the Chips and Cheese website. I'm probably going to write stuff there. I may not make videos because that's just harder. And to close out, I'd like to thank everyone for watching, and I hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope you have found this interesting.